because of the benefits they receive. So there's an assumption in much of the, for example, political science literature, and there's an implicit assumption in most of what President Obama says, that there are two types of people. There are selfish, greedy people who work in the market, and there are good, honest, common good-oriented people who go and work in government or work in the non-profits. Two types of people. Well, the public choice rule says, wait a minute, they're all human beings. What do we know about human beings? We know that human beings, most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, are driven by their own self-interest. If we believe that in the private sector, that's how we understand people's actions, they want to maximize their income, for example, then why don't we apply the same thing to people in the political, and I'd add, the non-profit realm? They too are driven by their own self-interest. And one of the goals of the public choice school is to so-called de-romanticize the state. Get away with this assumption. The state is driven by the common good, the market is driven by selfishness and greed. Now, as I said, in the marketplace, we sort of assume they're driven by increasing their income. Is that what drives people in the political realm? And the public choice will say, maybe, you do get the Menendez of the world or whatever who seem to be interested in using political power for their financial benefit. But actually, most people engaged in the political world, they have other forms of self-interest. So the politician, they want to be in office. So what do? They offer goodies to every group in society. Vote for me, and I'll subsidize your higher education. Vote for me, and I'll make sure your social security is not affected. So they pay off different groups in order to get re-elected. So that's what the self-interest of politicians. Bureaucrats, and I think they're a heavily under-researched area by libertarians, full-time officials. It's in their interests to have a bigger government. The more power they have, the more resources they have, it's better for them. So bureaucrats want a bigger government. And the third main area of political actors are interest groups. And most interest groups, what they want to do is to use the power of the government to work in their interests. So, for example, you get the steel industry wanting to have protectionism against importing steel from abroad because it's in their interests. And why is it, for example, despite the myth, many big corporations want regulation because they have the resources. If the regulation is introduced, it may cost them something, but what it may do is make it almost impossible for a new small company to rise to compete with them. So in fact, many regulations are driven by business, not by government. So interest groups, most interest groups, they see government as a way of protecting their interests. Now, there's a concept that the public choice school uses, which I think is really useful, the problem of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. Concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. So let me give my favorite example. Support for agriculture. In the United States, roughly 3% of the population is engaged in the agricultural sector. So agricultural protection, agricultural subsidies, what does that mean? It means that 97% of the American public are worse off because of this policy. So you pay more when you go into the supermarket for food, and you pay higher taxes to support it. Well, you think you live in a democracy, here's a policy which is good for 3%, bad for 97%. Well, obviously in a democracy, the 97% would win. But they don't. Every time there's an attempt to try and reduce support for the agricultural sector, it fails. How do we explain that? Well, the public choice say is that the 3% who benefit from these policies, they really, really care about it because their income is tied up with these government policies. What about the 97%? Well, they never think about agriculture. It's not an issue that engages them. But even if they did, we're talking probably about $4 a week per American citizen. They're not going to get really excited. So the agricultural lobby, they will vote for candidates who support agricultural subsidies. They will campaign for them. They'll give them money. They will throw manure over candidates who don't support subsidies. And the rest of the population don't really care about it. So we end up with policies that is bad for 97% of the population. But because the benefits are concentrated in the hands of a few, the costs are dispersed among everywhere else, they don't really, it doesn't really change. And the public choice school argues this is true of most of what government does. Most of what government does is not about protecting the public good. Most of what it does is designed to favour these special interests.